Your car says something about you. Not the model, not the color, the dirt. And psychologists have been paying very close attention. There's a specific type of person who drives the same unwashed car for months, sometimes years. Mud on the fenders, dust so thick you could write your name on the hood, bird droppings that have become practically permanent. And if you ask them about it, they shrug. I'll get to it eventually. But eventually never comes. And that's not an accident. That's psychology.
Most people assume this comes down to laziness. Simple, clean explanation. But laziness is almost never the real answer. It's the story we tell when we haven't looked deep enough. Because when researchers started studying how people relate to their personal spaces and possessions, they discovered something that changes the entire way you see this behavior.
The dirty car isn't the problem. It's the symptom. Think about the last time your environment felt chaotic. Your room, your desk, your car. How did you feel on the inside during that same period? For most people, there's a striking parallel. Our external world tends to mirror our internal one with uncomfortably accuracy. Psychologists call this environmental reflection, and it's one of the most quietly powerful forces shaping your daily life without you ever realizing it.
Now here's where it gets personal. People who never wash their car typically fall into one of several psychological profiles, and at least one of them is going to sound uncomfortably familiar. The first profile is the detached pragmatist. This is someone who has mentally classified their car as a pure tool.
It gets them from point A to point B. Full stop. These individuals often score high in what psychologists call low object attachment. They form minimal emotional bonds with material possessions. To them, washing a car is like polishing a hammer. Technically possible, but why? They reserve their emotional energy for people and ideas, not things. Interestingly, studies show this type often has deeply meaningful personal relationships precisely because they don't waste psychological investment on status symbols. The dirty car isn't neglect, it's a value system. But there's a second profile that looks almost identical on the surface and is psychologically worlds apart. The overwhelmed avoider. This person wants to wash the car. They think about it, they might even feel guilty about it, but something always stops them. The task sits on the mental to-do list, quietly growing heavier until it becomes so loaded with procrastinated guilt that approaching it feels almost impossible. Sound familiar? This pattern is heavily associated with executive dysfunction, the brain's difficulty initiating tasks that don't produce immediate reward.
It's a hallmark feature of ADHD, depression, and anxiety. The dirty car becomes a physical monument to every task that felt too heavy to start. And the cruel irony is that the longer it sits unwashed, the harder it becomes to address, because now it carries the emotional weight of all that avoidance.
This is why telling someone with depression to just clean your car is like telling someone with a broken leg to just walk it off. The barrier isn't motivation, it's neurological. Here's something most people never consider. The way you treat your possessions is often a direct reflection of how you feel you deserve to be treated.
Psychologists studying self-worth and behavioral patterns found a striking correlation. People who chronically neglect their personal environment, not out of detachment but out of avoidance, frequently carry an unconscious belief that they and their belongings simply aren't worth the effort. It's not a conscious thought. Nobody wakes up and says, "I don't deserve a clean car." But somewhere beneath the surface, the behavior tells a different story. Self-neglect rarely announces itself. It whispers through 1,000 small decisions. The meal you skipped, the appointment you postponed, the car you never washed. Now let's talk about the rebels, because there's a third profile that psychology doesn't discuss enough. These are people who grew up in households where appearances were everything, where the lawn had to be perfect, the house had to be presentable, and judgment was always one dirty window away. For these individuals, not washing the car is an act of quiet defiance. It's psychological freedom. Every layer of dust is a small declaration of independence from a childhood built around keeping up appearances for other people. The dirty car isn't failure, it's liberation. You'll often find this type in other areas of their life, too. They resist rigid routines, feel suffocated by social expectations, and place enormous value on authenticity. The unwashed car is just one expression of a much larger refusal to perform for an audience. And then there's the fourth profile, and this one is perhaps the most surprising. The high achiever with selective blindness. These are busy, driven, often highly successful people whose mental bandwidth is so completely consumed by their goals that entire categories of life simply fall off their radar. They're not depressed, they're not detached, they're tunnel-visioned. Their car is dirty because they genuinely haven't registered it as something that needs attention. Their brain has deprioritized it so completely it barely exists as a thought. CEOs, entrepreneurs, surgeons, the highest pressure environments produce people who develop an almost superhuman ability to filter out anything that doesn't directly serve their primary objective. The dirty car is the price of focus. What's fascinating is that all four of these profiles produce the same visible result, a dirty car, but for entirely different psychological reasons. This is why surface behavior is such a poor indicator of character. Two people can do the identical thing for completely opposite reasons. There's also a cultural dimension that rarely gets discussed. In certain cultures and communities, an immaculate car is a social signal, a marker of pride, status, and discipline. In others, it's considered almost vain, a waste of time that could be spent on family, work, or community. The psychology of car washing isn't just personal, it's inherited. The standards you hold yourself to were partially written for you long before you were old enough to hold a sponge. Let's bring this back to something concrete. Research in environmental psychology consistently shows that our spaces affect our mood, our stress levels, and our cognitive performance. A cluttered, dirty environment activates low-grade stress responses in the brain. But here's the nuance most people miss. This effect is much stronger in people who notice the disorder. For those low-attachment pragmatists, the dirty car registers as background noise. Their stress response barely flickers. But for the overwhelmed avoider, every glance at that unwashed car is a small psychological wound, a reminder of something undone, something failed, something heavy. This means the same dirty car is two completely different psychological experiences, depending on who's sitting behind the wheel. So what does your car say about you? Not in a judgmental way, in an honest one. Because the real insight here isn't about car washing at all. It's about the relationship between your external environment and your internal world. It's about what we choose to maintain, what we let slide, and why those choices are rarely as random as they seem. The things we neglect are almost always telling us something we haven't been willing to hear. The dirty car sits in the driveway, not as an eyesore, not as evidence of laziness or failure, but as a quiet, patient mirror, reflecting something about values, about capacity, about self-perception, about history. The question was never really why don't they wash their car? The question is, what would you find if you actually listened to what the answer reveals?